Hey, what's up, guys? Sorry for the delay in getting this video up. It has just, let's say it's been a busy day. So I just had a chance to sit down and try to go over some of these answers with you. So I've got 15 minutes here. So I'm going to go as fast as I can to try to get through as many of these questions as I can. So if I don't get through everything, please come see me in the morning or before the quiz. If you have me fourth period, or before the test, I should say. If you have me fourth period, come see me during Titan time, and I'll clear up any questions I might not get to. So let's go ahead and get into it. So number one, the difference between imperialism and colonialism is with colonialism, you're actually sending settlers from your country to settle a smaller country. So imperialism and colonialism are both about larger countries taking over smaller countries. But the difference is, as I said, with colonialism, you actually have settlers coming from the mother country over to the colony. Like when you had Great Britain, the large empire, colonizing North America, making colonies like Georgia and Virginia and New York. They actually sent British settlers over to the New World to settle that land. But if you look like India, the British Empire also added India to their empire, but they didn't send British settlers over there into India. They just let the native Indian people stay there. So a little difference there. Number two, the main factor motivating American imperialism was economic gain. It was all about making money. Number three, before the Civil War, examples of American imperialism included, definitely you can say, the efforts with the Native Americans, basically wiping them off their lands and taking their lands from them, forcing them onto small reservations. Of course, the Mexican-American War we talked about is part of Manifest Destiny, where the United States essentially starts a war and then takes a bunch of land in the southwest from Mexico. You can also say the Louisiana Purchase could be an example as well, all expanding the size of the United States. All right, number four, remember, yellow journalism is the practice of exaggerating news stories, really outrageous exaggerations of news stories. You might take some small shred of truth and blow it up out of proportion, make it seem like some huge deal, because basically they were trying to sell newspapers, trying to sell magazines. So they had these outrageous headlines to catch people's attention, just kind of like the tabloid magazines you see at the grocery stores. You're walking by, you're standing in the checkout line, you can't help but look up and see the outrageous headlines. You're like, oh, let me pick this up and just look at it. So that's what they were going for. And with yellow journalism, the outrageous stories that they were spreading were about Spanish atrocities in Cuba. So this contributed to the outbreak of war between the United States and Spain, sorry, the typo there, because the yellow journalists were spreading sensational, outrageous, and highly exaggerated stories about Spanish brutality against the Cubans in Cuba. That made the Americans angry, and they also believed that the Americans had business interest in Cuba, so if Spain's coming and messing with the Cubans, that could mess with the American economy and their ability to make cash. Number five, so just as we were talking, the root cause of the Spanish-American War was the Cuban Revolutions. Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire before the Spanish-American War. Spain was slowly, or I should say quickly actually, losing pretty much all of their colonies around the world, and Cuba was one of those. They want to hold on to any colonies they can, especially Cuba. So when the Cubans start to rebel for independence, this is an issue for Spain. So they come into Cuba and they put down the rebellion with a very iron fist and very brutal way, and the Americans catch wind of what's happening, especially with the yellow journalists spreading the exaggerated stories, and that kind of eventually draws America into the war. Number six, Emilio Aguinaldo. So after the Americans win a very short, 4-month-long Spanish-American War, one of the things they gain access to is the Philippine Islands. Well, when the U.S. gains access to the Philippines, they have to make a choice. Do we let the Filipinos be independent, like the Cubans got their independence after the Spanish-American War, or does the United States take the Philippines and add it to the American Empire? Well, the U.S. decides to just take the Philippines and add it to the American Empire. So some of the Filipinos were led by a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo, and he led an independence movement, a rebellion against the Americans in the Philippines. It was not successful, but it was something that was very brutal for quite a period of time. Number 17, President Teddy Roosevelt wanted to build a canal through Panama because basically he wanted to shorten the travel time between or getting from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and vice versa. That was for trade purposes. It was also for military purposes. If the United States really wanted to build this empire around the world and conquer areas and add colonies to their empire, you had to be able to get from one ocean to the next very quickly to supply troops, for reinforcements, all sorts of different reasons. So it was critical that they have a canal where they can cut right through Central America and not to go all the way around the tip of South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. But number 8, that's easier said than done, because in order to gain the rights to build a canal through Central America, President Roosevelt had to encourage Panama to rebel against Colombia. Because Panama was part of Colombia at this time, so it's a problem. The Colombians don't want to allow the United States to build a canal through their country. So President Roosevelt, using his big stick policy, after the negotiation failed, he tried to speak softly to the Colombians and negotiate with them. The Colombians turned him down. So he said, all right, well, I got my big stick here. I'm going to use my military. And he encouraged the Panamanians to rebel against Colombia. He offers American military support. And ultimately, Panama gets its independence from Colombia. And then to kind of say thank you to the United States, they turn around and sign a deal that allowed the United States to build the canal right through their country. Number 9, the Boxer Rebellion was a rebellion in China, a Chinese rebellion against American involvement in the Chinese economy. The Americans were trying to tap into the Chinese economy as a source of trade. The Americans, during the Industrial Revolution, have a lot of new products to sell, but you need people to sell it to, and there's a ton of people in China. So it made sense to open the doors to China to sell products to them, but a lot of the Chinese did not take too kindly to that interference, so they rebelled. Number 10, the word corollary means in addition to. So the Roosevelt corollary was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. If you remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that the United States was not going to allow any European countries to come mess with the West, and that means interfere in affairs in the Western Hemisphere. They saw that as a threat to U.S. sovereignty. But with Monroe, they didn't exactly specify what the U.S. was going to do to stop European countries from messing with the West. So Roosevelt comes in and adds to the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt corollary, and he says specifically, if you come mess with the West, we're going to use our military to stop you. Number 11, President Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy involved you being willing to use the military to accomplish your goals. His very famous phrase was speak softly, but carry a big stick. What that means is speak softly, try negotiation, try to talk out your problems first. But that doesn't work. You have to have the threat of your military, because a lot of times countries aren't going to listen to you and they're going to take you seriously if you don't at least have the threat of your military. And Roosevelt believed in that strongly. Number 12, President William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, had a different view on diplomacy and imperialism. He didn't mind taking over countries around the world, but he didn't so much subscribe to the big stick diplomacy idea where you're using your military. He had a different idea called dollar diplomacy that involved American businessmen using their money to buy up all the businesses and all in foreign countries. And his idea was, if you own the businesses in foreign countries, you basically own the foreign country. Number 13, the best example of Taft's dollar diplomacy was his actions in China, where he was encouraging American businessmen, very wealthy American businessmen, to buy up railroads in China and also build new railroads in China, because the idea is if you control the railroads in a country, then at that time you were controlling what was traded. So they were trying to control China through their money, hence dollar diplomacy. Number 14, the best example of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy was his actions in Panama, in Colombia, where he was encouraging the Panamanians to rebel against Colombia. Number 15, President Woodrow Wilson comes along after Taft, and he had a different take on diplomacy and imperialism as well. And what we call his was missionary or moral diplomacy. And Wilson, what this involved was peacefully spreading democracy. He was really, at his core, he truly was opposed to imperialism. He thought it was immoral, he thought it was wrong, and he thought what the United States should do is work on spreading democracy through peaceful means, by educating foreign countries and letting them understand the benefits of democracy. Number 16, Americans were upset when the USS Maine exploded off the coast of Colombia because they thought the Spanish did it. A part of that was they were already riled up and angry at the Spanish over the reports in the yellow press from the yellow journalists exaggerating what the Spanish were doing. But there's really no evidence to indicate that the Spanish actually did blow up the USS Maine. Actually, most historians now look back and say that it was a mechanical failure of some sort, but the Americans didn't want to hear that. They were all on the let's kill Spain train. Number 17, as a result of winning the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gained the islands of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Number 18, Secretary of State John Hay issued the Open Door Notes, which is like the open door policy, that really what it is, it opened the door for the U.S. to trade in China. The U.S. was trying to exert a lot of control over trade in China. A lot of people in China to trade with. Number 19, raids by Pancho Villa, a bandit in Mexico, forced President Wilson to send the U.S. military into Mexico. So even though on one hand he's saying, I don't want to use military force in foreign countries, here he is doing that very same thing. It really wasn't because he wanted to, it's because he felt like he was pressured into it by American businessmen who were losing money with the attacks by Pancho Villa in Mexico and just across the border in Texas. Number 20, let's talk about World War I. The four main, look at that, M-A-I-N. Remember those letters, and you'll be fine. The four main causes of World War I were M is militarism, A, alliances, I, imperialism, N, nationalism. Number 21, so basically those four main causes, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, imagine you're mixing them all into this toxic mix, and it's just waiting for one little spark to set the whole thing off into flames and a massive explosion. So that spark that sets off those main causes that led to the outbreak of fighting in World War I was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the empire, and he was basically the prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Number 22, during World War I inside the United States, there were two laws passed, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Espionage means spying, sedition means like treason. So basically what these acts did, particularly the Sedition Acts, is it made it a crime to speak out and criticize the government and criticize the war effort inside the United States during World War I. So this is something that was very, very controversial because it's in reality, if you look back at it from the 10,000-foot view here, that was a violation of the First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. But there were people, especially Eugene Debs, was a very famous socialist who ran for president, who was actually put in jail for simply saying he did not agree with the war. He was sentenced to jail for 10 years, only served 3. Number 23, during World War I, so that means the civil rights and civil liberties of Americans were being violated during World War I. The Sedition Act would be a clear example of that. Number 24, pacifists believe that there's never a justification for a war. They love peace. Number 25, German U-boats were sinking ships in the ocean during World War I, and they were practicing what we call unrestricted submarine warfare, which means there's no restrictions on who they are going to fire on with their submarines. It doesn't matter if you're a naval vessel, actual battleship, or if you are just a civilian passenger liner. Number 26, the German use of unrestricted submarine warfare angered the United States and led them closer to war, made them very anti-German. Number 27, Lusitania was a British passenger liner that was sunk by a German U-boat, killing 128 Americans. There were 128 Americans on board. Number 28, the last straw that pushed the United States into World War I was the Zimmermann telegram. So be careful. The Americans were very upset by the sinking Lusitania because there were Americans on board. But the Germans said, hey, look, we warned you. And they did. We warned you, if you get on this ship and it comes into this area, this blockade zone, we're going to fire on you. We're going to sink it. And they did just what they said they were going to do. So Lusitania was sunk in 1915. The Americans did not join the war until 1970. So Lusitania and the submarine warfare pushes the Americans closer into the war, makes them anti-German, but it doesn't push them into the war. The last straw that did that, for number 28, was the Zimmermann telegram. So number 29, what with the Zimmermann telegram, what Germany did is Germany asked Mexico to attack the United States, and in return for that, they would make sure that Mexico regained a lot of the territory they lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War, like Arizona and New Mexico. Of course, that never happened because the Americans intercepted the Zimmermann telegram. When they see that and see what the Germans were trying to do behind their back, they take that as almost an act of war and jump into World War I. Number 30, President Woodrow Wilson believed that World War I should be a war to end all wars, so he created the League of Nations, would be a giant international alliance that he was hoping would be the solution to all wars. People would talk out their problems and have no reason to go to war. Number 31, one of President Wilson's goals in entering World War I was to make the world safe for democracy and spread, just say democracy. That's a terrible question. Sorry about that. Number 32, the Selective Service Act was a major part of the U.S. war effort because this was the very first draft in U.S. history. It was actually drafting men into the U.S. Army and increased the size of the U.S. military. Number 33, trench warfare was something that took place in France on the Western Front and involved very, very brutal warfare. Number 34, during World War I, no man's land referred to the area between the trenches on either side. You had the Germans on one side and the French on one side. That land in between them was no man's land because no man wanted to go in there. Number 35, conservation is basically preserving food as much as possible. Americans at home during World War I practiced conservation by growing their own food, what they called Victory Gardens. Also had things like Meatless Mondays to try to conserve food for the soldiers. Number 36, by agreeing to the Sussex Pledge, Germany pledged to not fire on American ships in the ocean, since America was neutral. They didn't live up to that, but this was an agreement after the sinking of Lusitania. Number 37, the Committee on Public Information was created during World War I to send out propaganda to get Americans to support World War I. Number 38, the War Industries Board was created during World War I to make sure that all the supplies soldiers needed were produced in the country. Number 39, the National War Labor Board was created during World War I to make sure the labor